My son called me at 7:58 in the morning, 2 minutes early, to tell me I wouldn't fit in at his promotion party. I was standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd packed his lunch every school day for 12 years. The kettle had just boiled. I remember the steam rising against the window as I answered, expecting him to share the good news about his new title. Instead, I got a careful pause. "Mom, about the celebration dinner," Daniel said. "I've been thinking. It's going to be a pretty specific crowd. Young professionals, my colleagues from Meridian. Lots of industry talk." "I can handle industry talk, Daniel. I handled your science fair projects, your college applications, your first job interviews." "I know, Mom, but I don't think you'd fit in at the party. It's a young professional crowd." He said it so smoothly, so casually, like he was telling me the weather. "You'd be uncomfortable," he continued, "and honestly, I'd be worried about you feeling out of place. It's better this way. We'll do a family lunch later." A family lunch later, as if that made up for it. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, watching the steam curl off my tea. I'd stopped seeing it by then. I was seeing other things instead. I saw myself pulling extra shifts at Franklin Elementary, grading papers until 11 o'clock at night, so I could put $40,000 toward his tuition at the University of Washington. Not a loan. A gift, because that's what mothers did. I saw the $25,000 check I'd written in 2005, the down payment on his first condo. "You'll pay me back when you're settled," I'd told him. He never did. I never asked. I saw every holiday I'd hosted, every dinner I'd cooked, every time Susan had rolled her eyes at my old-fashioned ways and Daniel had laughed along. None of that mattered anymore, because in his world now I was someone who wouldn't fit in. If this story strikes a chord with you, please subscribe to Revenge Stories. I have so many more to share. But for now, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. "I understand," I said. "Good luck with the party." "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd understand. That was the thing." He thought my silence was acceptance. He thought my calm meant I had no power. "Daniel, sweetheart, I taught for 40 years. I know how to keep control of a room without raising my voice." I hung up. The kettle was still warm. I poured my tea, sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped him with his 6th-grade math homework, the one about compound interest. He never quite understood that concept. How money given to you could cost you something later. I sat there for a long time, running my finger around the rim of my mug. 68 years old. A retired school teacher living alone in the house she bought in 1987. Owen had been gone for 9 years now, and I'd managed fine. I managed that morning, too. I dressed in my gray wool cardigan and walked to the market. I bought bread, eggs, a small bouquet of yellow tulips, but all the while I was building a file in my mind. Every dollar, every hour, every favor I'd ever done for that boy. Because if I was going to be uninvited from his life, I wanted to know exactly what it had cost me. "Wouldn't fit in," I said out loud, standing in the produce aisle. A woman next to me looked up, startled. I smiled at her, calm as anything. I finished my shopping. I walked home. I set my groceries on the counter. And then I opened my address book. The worn leather one, held together with a rubber band. I flipped past the pages of old neighbors, past my sister's number in Spokane, and I stopped at a name I hadn't called in years. Richard Ashford. We'd been friends at the University of Washington in 1978. Took the same philosophy class. He'd been a quiet kid with big glasses and a bigger brain. We'd kept in touch through the years, lost contact, reconnected, lost contact again, and somewhere in between, he'd become the CEO of Meridian Capital, the company where my son was vice president, the company whose corporate culture prided itself on family values. I had the number memorized. I hadn't called it in years. But I knew Richard would answer, and I knew exactly what I was going to say. I said nothing. I simply made a call that would change the trajectory of his career forever. But first, I needed to remember every single thing I'd done for him. I sat in the kitchen with the phone still in my hand, the kettle long forgotten. The water had gone cold. So had I, in a way. I thought about the numbers first. That was how my mind worked. 40 years of teaching arithmetic will do that to you. $40,000 for his tuition at the University of Washington? That's what it cost, spread across 4 years, paid out of a teacher's salary and careful savings. I packed my lunch every day instead of buying it. I drove the same Corolla for 11 years. I told myself it was worth it. Every dollar, I told myself, was an investment in his future. He never asked where the money came from. He just assumed it would be there. And it was, because that's what mothers do. Then there was the condo. March of 2005. He was 23 years old, fresh out of school, working his first real job at a small brokerage. He called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight with excitement and anxiety. He'd found the perfect place, he said, a one-bedroom in Belltown with a view of the water. But he couldn't get approved without a larger down payment. He didn't ask me for the money, not directly. He just talked about how close he was, how this could be the start of everything, how proud he'd be to own his own home at 23. I wrote him a check for $25,000. I remember the date on the check. I remember the way his hand shook when he took it from me. He hugged me, told me I was the best mom in the world, and promised he'd pay me back within 5 years. That was 19 years ago. He never paid me back. Not a single cent. And I never asked. Because that's what mothers do. I stood up from the table and walked to the hallway closet. The leather address book was on the top shelf, held together with a rubber band that had seen better days. I took it down and sat on the stairs, flipping through the worn pages. The entries blurred together. My sister's number in Spokane. The plumber I used once when the basement flooded. The florist who did Owen's funeral arrangements. Then I found Daniel's graduation, May 2004, Husky Stadium. I remember sitting in the stands for 3 hours, the sun beating down on my shoulders, my hands sweating in my lap. I'd bought him a gold watch for his graduation gift. A Seiko. Because he'd mentioned once that his supervisor wore one. When they called his name and he walked across the stage, I stood up and cheered. I waved so hard my arm ached. He looked up at the stands, and I caught his eye for just a moment. Then he looked away. He didn't wave back. Afterward, he introduced me to his friends. "This is my mom," he said. And that was it. No pride in his voice, just a statement of fact, like he was reading a footnote. I smiled through it all. I hugged him and told him I was proud of him. I gave him the watch. He said thanks and put it in his pocket, not even bothering to try it on. That should have told me something. Maybe it did. But I buried it the way mothers do. Susan came later. I met her in 2007 at Thanksgiving dinner. She was beautiful and polished, with sharp eyes that assessed everything in my kitchen within 30 seconds. She complimented the china, asked about the gravy recipe, said the house was quaint. Then she got to know me better. By 2010, the eye rolls had started. I'd mentioned something about budgeting, about saving for the future, about the value of a modest life. And Susan would look at Daniel across the table with a tight little smile. "Oh, Mom," he'd say, using that condescending tone I'd come to recognize. "The world's changed since you were teaching." I remember one Christmas. I brought a homemade apple pie to their place in Queen Anne. I spent 4 hours on it, using my mother's recipe. Susan opened the door, saw the pie, and said, "Oh, that's so old-fashioned of you. We ordered dessert from a caterer this year." She rolled her eyes as I set the pie on the counter. She thought I didn't see it. But I spent 4 decades watching children. I see everything. And here's the thing, I never said a word. For all these years, I kept my mouth shut and my ledger private. Every check I wrote, every favor I did, every slight I swallowed. I told myself it was what a mother does. But today, at 7:58 in the morning, my son told me I wouldn't fit in at his party. I closed the address book. I ran my thumb over the rubber band, feeling its age, remembering the day I'd bought it at the hardware store on 4th Avenue. I couldn't tell you the year. Some things are so ordinary they slip away. His graduation, his first job, his wedding, his promotion. Each milestone, I was there. Each time, I gave. And each time, he took and looked past me and found something better to look at. I thought about Richard, about that quiet kid with the big glasses who argued philosophy with me until 2 in the morning. I thought about what he must think of Daniel. And I thought about what I was about to do. I didn't feel guilty. That surprised me. I felt calm, clear. The way you feel when you finish grading a stack of papers and the numbers all add up. They did add up. Every dollar, every hour, every ounce of sacrifice. And he'd never once said thank you in a way that actually meant anything. I stood up, walked back to the kitchen and picked up the phone. My hand wasn't shaking. It wasn't even trembling. I had the number memorized. I hadn't called it in years. But I knew Richard would answer. And I knew exactly what I was going to say. The restaurant was called the Emerald Table. Richard had picked it, a quiet place on the top floor of an older building downtown, all dark wood and white tablecloths. I got there at 12:15, 15 minutes early. I always arrived early. It was a habit from 40 years of teaching. The hostess seated me by the window. I ordered water with lemon. I folded my hands on the table and waited. Richard walked in at 12:29, 1 minute early. He looked older than I remembered. His hair had gone completely gray, and he wore glasses now. But he had the same steady walk, the same unhurried way of moving. He spotted me immediately and smiled. It was a warm smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. He sat down across from me and said, "Margaret, you look wonderful." "I look like a woman who retired 6 years ago and finally started sleeping properly," I said. He laughed. "That's the truth of it, then." We ordered. He got the salmon. I got the chicken salad. We talked about the old days for a few minutes, about the University of Washington, about Professor Hargrove, who used to fall asleep mid-lecture. It was easy, comfortable, but I hadn't asked him here to talk about the past. I set down my fork. I looked at him directly. "Richard," I said, "I need to ask you something." He set down his fork, too. "Of course." "Danny's promotion," I said. "He mentioned he's been made vice president." Richard nodded. "He has. He earned it. He's done good work." "I'm proud of him," I said. "I've always been proud of him. But this morning he called me to tell me about the celebration dinner he's having." I paused. "He said he didn't think I'd fit in with his young professional crowd." Richard's hand stopped moving. He set his glass down slowly. "He said that?" "His exact words," I said. "He suggested I might be uncomfortable, that I might embarrass him. He offered to have lunch with me sometime instead, just the two of us, like he was doing me a kindness." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That doesn't sound like the Daniel I know, but it's concerning." I didn't say anything. I let the silence sit there. That was a trick I'd learned in the classroom. When you want someone to volunteer more, you give them room to fill. Richard filled it. "Margaret," he said, "I want you to know something about Meridian. We're a company that values family. We say it in our mission statement, but we also mean it. Every year at the gala, we give an award to the employee whose family has supported them the most. We believe that a person's character at home is a predictor of their character at work. It's not just talk." "I remember," I said. "You told me about that when Danny first joined." "I did, and I've watched Daniel climb. I've watched him work hard. I've watched him close deals and manage teams. But I've never asked him how he treats the people who helped him get there." He looked at me. "Until now." I kept my face neutral. "I didn't come here to cause trouble for him." "I know you didn't," Richard said. "That's exactly why I'm listening." He picked up his glass again. He took a sip. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "He's up for a major project right now," Richard said. "The Whitmore account. It's the biggest client we've had in 5 years. I was leaning toward giving it to him. He has the experience. He has the track record." I waited. "But now I'm not so sure," Richard said. "If he can't treat his own mother with respect, I have to question his judgment. I have to question his character." He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a man stating a fact. Like a man who had just seen a crack in a foundation and was trying to decide if the whole structure was unsound. "I don't know what to tell you," I said. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I just thought you should know." "You were right to tell me," Richard said. "That's what friends are for. That's what old friends are for." We finished our lunch. We talked about his wife, about my garden, about the weather. Normal things, human things. He paid for the meal. I protested, and he waved me off. "My treat," he said, "for old time's sake." I thanked him. He walked me to the door. He held it open for me, and then he said something that I would carry with me for a long time. "Margaret," he said, "I've known you for 46 years. You are not a woman who complains without reason. If you brought this to me, it's because it hurt you, and I don't take that lightly." He reached out and squeezed my hand once. Then he let go and walked back to his table. I walked to my car. I got in. I sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, looking out at the gray sky of the Pacific Northwest. Richard didn't say much after that, but I saw the look in his eyes. He was already thinking about Daniel differently, and I knew that was enough. The phone rang on a Tuesday, April 10th. I remember the date because I had just marked it on my kitchen calendar in blue ink. 2 weeks after my lunch with Richard, 11 days after Daniel's party at the Harbor Club, the one I wasn't invited to. I answered on the second ring. Mom, his voice had that tight quality, the one he gets when something hasn't gone his way. I recognized it from when he was 8 years old and didn't make the traveling soccer team. Daniel, I said, how are you? Fine, busy. Look, I need to talk to someone. I set down my tea. I knew this call was coming. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. The frustrated tone. The need to vent to someone safe. I'm listening, I said. He sighed. A long, dramatic exhale that I could hear clearly through the speaker. Then he started talking. They gave the Whitmore project to Marcus. I knew the name. Marcus Bennett. Richard had mentioned him at lunch. A young man, hard-working, respected by his peers. The kind of employee who earned promotions on merit rather than entitlement. Oh, I said, I thought you were expecting that account. I was. Everyone was. It was mine. I've been building toward it for 18 months. I heard ice clinking in a glass. He was at home then. It was early afternoon. Susan was probably nearby, listening. He never called me during work hours unless something had gone wrong. Did they give you a reason? I asked. That's the thing. There was no reason, no explanation, no feedback. Just an email from HR saying the account had been reassigned to Marcus. I didn't even get the courtesy of a meeting. Shiz. I made a small sound, sympathetic, neutral. The same sound I'd made 1,000 times when he was a boy and had scraped his knee or lost a school election. Have you talked to Richard about it? Silence on the line. Then a low laugh. I tried. He's been impossible to pin down. His assistant keeps rescheduling. Twice now? That's not normal. No, I thought. It wasn't normal, but I knew why. Richard had heard what Daniel said about his mother. And Richard was a man who believed that how you treat the people who raised you says everything about who you are. Maybe he's just busy, I said. No, something's off. I can feel it. And I've got my annual review coming up in a few weeks. If they're reassigning accounts like this, I don't know what they're going to say. I walked over to my kitchen window. The sun was out. A rare spring day in this city. The daffodils I'd planted in the fall were blooming along the fence line. When was your review scheduled? I asked. First week of May. It's been on the calendar since January. An annual review. That Richard would conduct personally. Richard, who now looked at Daniel differently. Gow! Richard, who had known me for 46 years and didn't take my concerns lightly. You're a strong candidate, I said. You've done good work. I'm sure it will be fine. He made a sound. Not quite a laugh. A grunt of frustration. People don't understand how much I'd given to this company. I built my entire career there. I was loyal. I did everything right. And now some kid with fresh energy swoops in and takes the account I've been cultivating for years. I didn't say anything. Marcus, he said, and the name came out like a bitter taste. I don't even know what he's done to deserve it. He's been there, 3 years? Closer to 5, I thought, but I didn't correct him. He probably just smiles at the right people, Daniel said. Plays the game. I watched a bee land on one of the tulips near my porch steps. Daniel kept talking. It went on for about 20 minutes. He moved from the Whitmore account to his general frustration with the company culture. Too much emphasis on collaboration, not enough recognition of individual effort. He told me about how his parking spot had been moved, which he was sure was a slight, and how someone in his department didn't say good morning to him last week. By the end, his voice had lost some of its sharpness. He sounded tired. I just don't know what's happening, he said. Everything was fine 6 weeks ago. I was on track. I had momentum. Now it feels like the ground shifted underneath me. I almost smiled then, because I knew exactly what was happening. Maybe it's just a rough patch, I said. These things happen. You beat it by staying steady. Yeah, maybe. He paused. I heard him take a drink of whatever was in his glass. Thanks for listening, Mom. It helps to talk to someone who doesn't have a stake in the office politics. Of course, I said. I'm always here for you. Anyway, I should go. Susan wants to look at tile samples for the bathroom renovation. Good luck with that. He laughed. Short, forced. Yeah, we'll see. The line went dead. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter. Then I picked up my teacup. It was still warm. I took a sip and looked out the window again. I felt calm, not vindictive, not triumphant, just calm. The way a person feels when they found the right tool for a job, when they know exactly how a situation will unfold and have already prepared for it. Daniel was worried about his upcoming review. He should be. Richard would sit across from him and see a vice president who thought his own mother wasn't good enough to be around his colleagues. A man who made $85,000 a year, more than the salary of the school teacher who paid for his degree. He would never connect it to me. He had spent 42 years not seeing me as someone with power, a retired teacher knitting in her kitchen, a widow in a house she bought 37 years ago, a mother who still made applesauce from the tree in the backyard. I had taught arithmetic for 40 years. I could count exactly how much I'd given him, and I could count how many times he'd thanked me. I could also count the days until his review. 23. The gala was on September 28th at the Grand Meridian Ballroom downtown. I arrived alone. Daniel and Susan had offered to drive me, but I told them I had a friend who lived nearby and would meet them there. Richard had arranged for me to sit at his table. I wore a navy blue dress I'd bought on sale at Nordstrom over a year ago. It felt right. Formal enough for the occasion, plain enough to disappear. The ballroom was enormous. Crystal chandeliers, white table linens, waiters carrying silver trays of champagne. I saw Marcus Bennett near the stage, shaking hands with a man I recognized as the chief financial officer. Marcus looked calm. He wasn't working the room like a man hungry for attention. He was just talking, listening, nodding. Daniel found me before dinner was served. He looked sharp in his charcoal suit, his hair freshly trimmed. He kissed my cheek and said, "Glad you came, Mom." Susan's saving seats for us. He wanted me to sit with them, but I'd already told him about Richard's table. Daniel's face flickered. Just for a second. He didn't know Richard well. The CEO of his own company, and my son barely knew him. He said, "Oh, right, the friend." Then he smiled, smooth and practiced, and walked back to Susan. I watched them across the room. Susan was leaning in to whisper something to a woman beside her. She laughed, her hand touching her pearls. Daniel was laughing too, but his eyes kept darting toward the stage, toward the podium. He knew what was coming. He'd been told to expect big news that night. Dinner was served at 8. I ate my salmon quietly, listening to the executive next to me discuss a merger. Richard raised his glass to me at one point. "Oh," just a small gesture. No one noticed, but I did. The speeches began around 9:30. A few awards, a retirement announcement, a thank you to the event sponsors. Then Richard stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, looked out at the room, and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I have one final announcement to make." The room went quiet. I saw Daniel straighten in his chair. Susan put her hand on his arm. His whole face lit up. He thought he knew what was coming. He had been talking about this night for months. Not to me, of course, but I'd heard through mutual friends. He expected the senior vice president title. He expected the bigger office, the bigger bonus, the bigger everything. Richard glanced down at a card in his hand. Then he looked up. "Joining us tonight is a man who started here as an intern 9 years ago," Richard said. He put in the long hours, earned the respect of his peers, and demonstrated the core values that Meridian Capital was built on. Integrity, hard work, and humility. I watched Daniel's smile start to fade. His jaw tightened. "It's my great honor to introduce your new senior vice president," Richard said. Marcus Bennett. The applause was instant, genuine. Genuinely genuine. I saw Marcus stand up, look stunned for a moment, then shake hands with his wife before moving toward the stage. He looked like a man with his feet on firm ground. "But Daniel!" Daniel sat frozen. His lips parted slightly. His face drained to a pale gray, like a man who'd just been slapped awake. He lifted his hands and clapped. Weakly. Twice. Then he dropped them and stared at the tablecloth. Susan looked at him. Her mouth was a tight, thin line. She was furious, not at the company, at him. She believed his promises. She'd told her friends. She'd picked out the table setting for the celebratory dinner he planned for that weekend. I watched them from 8 tables away. Daniel forced a smile during the toast. Forced it hard. His knuckles were white around his wine glass, and he didn't touch the champagne. He just sat there, nodding, while the room celebrated another man's ascendancy. I felt nothing. No, that's not true. I felt the quiet satisfaction of justice served cold. The seed I had planted in March had grown into a tree, and it had borne fruit exactly on schedule. The next hour passed in slow motion. Daniel's hand shook when he picked up his fork. He didn't eat. Susan pulled out her phone and typed furiously for 10 minutes straight. I saw her mouth the words, "I told you so," without a sound. They left early, before dessert. Susan rose abruptly, grabbed her purse, and walked toward the coat check without looking back. Daniel followed a few steps behind. He waved at a colleague. The wave was too quick, too tight. By the time they reached the exit, Daniel paused. He turned his head, and for one terrible moment, he looked across the entire room. Right at me. I smiled, a calm, pleasant, motherly smile. He didn't smile back. His eyes met mine, and for a second he looked like a lost boy. Then he turned away and followed his wife out into the cold night air. But I sat there in the warm light of the ballroom, listening to the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of happy conversation. Richard was walking across the room toward the stage, shaking hands, accepting congratulations for his bold choice. He caught my eye as he passed our table. "No!" He nodded, slow, deliberate. I nodded back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Marcus Bennett was announced as the senior vice president at 9:47 that night. Daniel's world had been redesigned in the blink of an eye. I watched his empty chair at the next table over. The napkin was still crumpled on the floor where Susan had dropped it on her way out. I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt the calm of a woman who had paid for a full meal and finally stopped leading tips. As the applause died down, Daniel caught my eye from across the room. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I smiled back. The first few months after the gala, Daniel and I barely spoke. He called on Christmas, but it was short. He asked about the weather. I told him it was raining. He said it was raining there too. We hung up after 4 minutes. I heard from a neighbor that he and Susan had taken a trip to Hawaii in November. Expensive, the neighbor said. I didn't ask for details. By January, the silence felt normal. I tended to my garden. I made applesauce from the tree in the backyard. I read books from the library. I didn't think about Meridian Capital much at all. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late February, my phone rang. It was Daniel. "Mom," he said. His voice sounded flat. "Tired." "Daniel," I said. He asked if he could come over. Just him, no Susan. That was unusual. I told him I'd put the kettle on. He arrived at 3. He looked different. His shoulders were slumped. His shirt was wrinkled, which was unlike him. He didn't sit at the kitchen table. He leaned against the counter, holding his coffee cup with both hands. "I'm not getting the promotion," he said. I waited. He took a breath. "They gave it to someone else." Again. "Some kid named Patel from the New York office. He's 34. I nodded slowly. I didn't know anyone named Patel, but that didn't matter. "What did Richard say?" I asked. Daniel shrugged. "Richard barely talks to me anymore. He reschedules my meetings. He gives me busy work. I sit in my office and I draft reports nobody reads." He set his cup down. "It's over, Mom. My career at Meridian is over." I can feel it. I studied his face. There was confusion there. Genuine confusion. He genuinely had no idea what had happened to him. He couldn't see the connection between his own words and his own downfall. "Maybe it's time to look elsewhere," I said gently. He laughed. It was a hollow sound. "Elsewhere." At 42. as a vice president nobody wants. Sure, I'll get right on that. He left 20 minutes later. He hugged me at the door, which he hadn't done in years. It was a brief, awkward hug, but it was a hug. I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt something else, something quieter. He resigned from Meridian Capital on June 15th. I know the date because my new calendar had a small blue line I drew when Susan called to tell me. He resigned, she said, her voice tight. He just walked in and did it. No notice. No plan. Where will he go? I asked. A smaller firm. Morrison and Reed, 3 floors, 40 people. A step down, Margaret. A real step down. I could hear her anger. It wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at Daniel. He was supposed to be senior vice president by now, she said. I told my friends, I told everyone, and now he's just Andrew Morrison's understudy, or whatever. She paused. I don't understand what happened. He was on track. He was golden. Then everything just stalled. I made a small sound of sympathy. You know what the worst part is? Susan said. He won't even talk about it. He says office politics. He says timing. He won't admit that something went wrong. Something that he caused. I thanked her for letting me know. I hung up and sat in my kitchen. I looked at the apple tree through the window. The blossoms were just starting. A step down. 40 people. Morrison and Reed. I didn't gloat. I didn't apologize. I slept very well that night. And the night after that. And every night since. The garden is where I find myself these days. The apple tree is heavy with fruit. The same one I've watched for nearly 40 years. I was in the vegetable patch when I heard the mail truck. Just a handful of bills in a catalog. Nothing from Daniel. He moved to Portland last spring. Susan followed him 2 months later. I heard through my sister in Spokane, who heard from a cousin who still plays bridge with Susan's mother. They bought a smaller house than the one in Queen Anne. 3 bedrooms instead of 5. I never asked for details. I didn't need them. A step down. That's what Susan called it. The words have echoed in my head since that phone call. You know what I've realized? Disrespect has a cost. It's not always visible. It doesn't show up as an eviction notice or a bankruptcy filing. Sometimes it's quieter. It's a missed promotion that was supposed to be yours. It's a big account going to someone younger. It's watching your husband's confidence erode month after month until he stops talking about work entirely. That was Daniel's price. He never knew I paid it for him. I suppose that's the part people find hard to believe. They think revenge should be seen. They think the person should know it was you. But I've learned that the most effective consequences are the ones that look like fate. The ones that leave the person blaming everything except what they should have realized. Daniel blamed office politics. He blamed timing. He blamed the economy, the industry, his colleagues. He even blamed Susan for pushing him to stay at Meridian instead of interviewing elsewhere earlier. He never once blamed the thing that actually mattered. Bats? The way he treated the woman who gave him everything. Wouldn't fit in. Those words ended up costing him more than he'll ever know. The Whitmore account. The senior vice president role. His reputation at a firm where he was once considered golden. All of it gone because he couldn't spare 5 minutes to include his mother in his celebration. I think about that a lot. How such a small cruelty can ripple so far. I dug up the ledger last week. The one I kept all those years. It's a bound book, green leather, the kind teachers used to keep in the old days. I had written everything. $40,000 for tuition. $25,000 for the down payment on his condo in 2005. The gold Seiko watch for his graduation. The $3,000 I gave them when Susan's mother was sick and they needed help with the hospital bills. Every entry in my careful teacher's handwriting. Every amount paid. Every promise that was never repaid. I burned it on Tuesday. I know, it sounds strange. Keeping something like that for so long feels possessive. But I needed it. Not to hold against Daniel anymore. I needed to remember what I'd given. Because for years, I think I forgot. I let him make me feel small. I let him and Susan treat me like an obligation, like a dusty piece of furniture they kept in the corner because moving it would be rude. The ledger reminded me of the truth. I was the foundation. I was the reason he stood where he stood. And when he decided I was beneath him, he showed who he really was. That's what I told Richard at our last lunch. We meet every few months at the Emerald Table, the same place where this whole thing started. He orders salmon. I get the chicken salad. We talk about old friends, old times, the University of Washington in 1978 when we were both too poor to eat at restaurants like this. I never thanked him directly. He never brought it up, but at the end of our meal, he raised his water glass and said, "To the strongest person I've ever known." That was enough. That was everything. Daniel is 46 now. He's still at Morrison and Reed. Andrew Morrison retired last year, but the board chose someone from outside to take over. Daniel was passed over again. My sister told me he's become quiet, withdrawn. Susan goes to Portland art galleries alone on weekends. Their marriage is a shell of what it was. I feel no joy in that. I want you to understand something. This was never about pleasure. It was about the truth of what I was worth. I learned it late. I was 68 when my own son told me I didn't fit in. But I learned it. Parental love is not a doormat. It's not a bottomless well that gives and gives without end, no matter how much you're treated like an inconvenience. Because when love is treated like it's worthless, it becomes worthless. Not because it doesn't have value, but because it has been devalued by the person who received it. I watered the tomatoes this morning. The beans are nearly ready to harvest. My hands ache when I kneel, and I pretend it doesn't bother me. Some things just take a little longer now. My life is small. I like it that way. I have my garden. I have my books. I have Richard at the end of a phone line, a friendship that has outlived everything else. And I have peace, real peace, the kind that settles in your bones, the kind that lets you look back at the hardest decision you ever made and recognize it as necessary. Not kind, not elegant, necessary. Daniel doesn't call much anymore. A birthday, a Christmas sometimes, 4 minutes long, always. We have nothing left to say to each other. I made my choice, and I made it knowing the cost. A complete child, a distant one, but a child who learned that his mother could not be crossed. 13 days until we picked the apples. I noticed the tulips were the first thing to bloom this spring. Yellow ones, like the ones I bought at the market the morning Daniel called me. I planted more this year. When they come up, I'll remember. Not with bitterness, with stillness. Respect is not owed to those who take it for granted. I learned that in my kitchen at 7:58 in the morning with the kettle still warm and my son's voice on the phone. I learned it twice. And I sleep very well. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more stories like this one.